All right, so hi, you guys. I think I know most of you, but for those that don't, I'm going to start and give a brief explanation of the work that I do and why I'm up here talking about this topic. I'm Ksenya Samarskaya. I run a small design studio in Brooklyn, New York. And when I'm up here, I'm part of a team, and I'm talking for the collective. My practice is a collaboration model that features a rotating kick-ass designers, developers, copywriters, and artists that were all part of these projects. And I am going to go back to what I started with. What I actually studied and what I worked on back in the day was installation art and what was back then called physical computing. So it was a lot of built environments, incorporating whatever experimental technology we could find, we could break, we could pull apart, and talking about the narrative structure, how it talked to traditional materials, and what various trajectories would look like taken to their logical extremes. This is a 2004 installation in Portland, Oregon that I did in collaboration with Nathan Hazard. There's some glittery pre-millennial pink televisions in there. These are two close-ups from a 2003 installation. It was actually a series of 3 installations that I did with Daniel Bissell, where we explored memory, bureaucracy, evidence, what we notice, what we overlook. We created a fictional ministry of observations, and there was a lot of interactive video that would disappear and that would get erased by people being in the space. In 2003, I received an RICC grant, which resulted in staging of a registry of existence in the Portland building, which I worked on in collaboration with Brett Twenge and Daniel Bissell, where we explored bureaucracy, psychology, government intrusion of private life, fake news, and the seeming futile process of getting basic things done. So we created a mock registry of existence with forums and instructional videos and testing gadgets that you walk in behind the cubicle booth and see if machines tell you if you actually exist or not. And then in 2005, I worked on an installation called Translatech, which kind of went back to the 1950s, pulled from utopian communication-driven origins of technology, and just kind of dealt with that and the ideas of translation, dealing with how whenever you're communicating, what the person's saying, what someone else is hearing is not exactly the same, and just the entire broken telephone chain. So I kind of loved putting things into Google Translate and translating it from English to something else, and then getting it back. So here we modified some voice recognition software and created our own dictionaries for it. So you'd come into the gallery, it would listen to what you said, it would go through the voice recognition, it would go through a back computer that ran a radio transmitter, and it would output through a TTY phone. So you get this little receipt of what you said that got half of it and made up the other half. So it's a lot of focusing on technology, breaks in technologies, and where the desire goes versus the practical reality. Then in 2005, I moved to New York, and doing installations in New York was a pain in the ass. I didn't have a studio, I didn't have a truck, so I decided I needed to work much smaller, and type design was the logical conclusion on bringing my practice to a smaller scale. So I started, these are some of the initial type design projects that I worked on. And then over the past 10 years, I've drawn Cyrillic, Latin, and Greek. I've done a lot of research on global type support, both in terms of glyph coverage and semantic meaning and connotations. This is my house font, Wyeth. It's also what I'm using throughout the presentation. This is 2014 font that I made for BestMed Co. that was released earlier this year through Rosetta Type Foundry. This is Diode, which we developed to read as that projection is probably not going to do it exactly justice, but I got it to a point where I could read it fairly comfortably at 4 or 5 points on a Retina screen. So I've also done a lot of research into how to get type small, how to get it to read on for different printing, different papers, different monitors, broadcasts, and how to optimize type for these situations. And then the other section of what I do is branding and adapting things for the internet. So there we do a lot of figuring out how we can get type to sing and how we can get it to encompass the entirety of the message, how it appears, how it disappears, how it can capture your attention without assaulting you like banner ads, how it can trigger memories, connotations, emotions. So this one on screen, it responds to your mouse. On mobile, it responds to gravity and the tilt sensor. Reading live data and how text enters and exits a situation. This is from my splash page. So Samarskaya Partners, I'll abridge to S&P a lot, and the metaphor I always like using is salt and pepper, because it's just black and white, and it's as minimal and basic as you can get, but if you use it right, it's all the flavor you need for a thing. So we created an interaction where as you move around with your finger or your mouse on screen, it feels like you're pushing grains of salt on a table if you spill, and you can kind of keep playing with that. And then sometimes we'll take on or do other larger web projects. This is galvanized jets. In 2014, I got really frustrated with proofing type and how most proofs it was either every glyph against every glyph, which I don't think is a very good way of seeing kerning and type in context, or they were these long InDesign files that would break, that would take an hour or two to kind of input your font in and pull together. So we created, animation, go. So we created this so you can kind of drag any font in. It exists for Latin, Cyrillic, and Greek, because those are the languages I primarily work with. And it pulls from a live dictionary that gets you, on the kern page, it gets you every kern pair in a different word every time, and it puts it in the middle of a word. It's also an amazing word list, because if you create these kind of complicated requirements for the words you want, you're going to get some really cool stuff. And it was also really fun creating a user interface for an audience of less than 10, because it was just me and a couple friends and my students that are using this. So you can play and experiment a lot more. So my love for tech futurism has always been the way that it simultaneously looks forwards and backwards. It's what I toyed with directly in the Translatech project, and it's why I felt such a natural home in the world of type design, which constantly is reaching in both directions. If you're like to think about and envision the future right now and close your eyes and kind of visualize the world, and I ask you what people are wearing, they're going to be wearing things from either the 60s or the 90s, which I find an amazing contrast and contradiction. And then because of the explorative nature of my work, over the past couple of years, I've been asked a lot to design color fonts, three-dimensional fonts, variable fonts. And despite a constant excitement to play with new toys, I've often dragged my heels because and I'd kind of wait until I could mentally construct a really good real-life use case scenario for this stuff. So when I agreed to give this talk on the extended reality world of augmented and virtual reality world, I didn't know exactly what I was going to start with or where I was going to get to. So the rest of this is going to be a really overarching overview of what's happening there right now and what kind of my takeaway is. I've played with augmented reality before in the past, but it was always just like, it felt like using it for like fancy, pretty QR codes. And I've never really questioned exactly how type functions with it, how it could function or how it should. And so this is the culmination of me trying to understand that. So normally people will do their credits at the end, but this entire talk is on the shoulders of all the amazing people that I've talked to and all their research and information, how we're able to kind of come together and think through this stuff. So I want to thank Timothy West, who's the director of XR research at Unity, Sarah Rothberg, who's the AR/VR professor at the New School, Brian Chaslow, who does AR and VR for Chris Milk and Childish Gambino, Emma Diazev, who's the AR art director of Facebook Messenger, Zach Lieberman, who's an independent AR artist, Alex Farberg, who's AR/VR at Google, Mitch Paone, who does visual experiments with his company Dia TV, Nitin Bartov, the Media Lab fellow at The Economist, Stefan Bouchard, who's the developer of TextMesh Pro, the text engine running for Unity, Jono Brendel, the lead designer at Within, Aza Raskin, Ivan Papurev, who's in Google's advanced technology projects and was also doing a lot of VR experiments in the 90s, Alex Kaufman, who's behind Google Cardboard, and Alan Yu, who worked on Google Glass. And so basically I had hours of conversations with all these people. I'm going to try to summarize it for you and kind of get an understanding of what's happening, what the problems are, what people are thinking about, what they're not thinking about, and how we as type designers and type developers can help or meet them in that space. So I'll go into a very brief history. So I think the beginning of people thinking about virtual and augmented reality started in the 1800s with the beginnings of practical photography and cinema. There was one Medium article I read where the author lambasted AR as being entrenched in the photographic and cinematic tradition as that was kind of the negative thing about it, and that was what was keeping it back. But to me, I love the cinematic and photographic tradition. It's a beautiful world. It edits our life and experiences in a really nice way. And today, we're interacting with photography and video so many times a day, it's kind of impossible to count. So to me, I don't see that as limitation of the field. To me, that's a really beautiful extension of it. Then there was kind of a lot of experiments in the 50s where they were creating sensory theaters and creating patents for machines that sound pretty fantastical now, and where it was talked about the cinema of the future. So everything that's happening now is not necessarily new thinking, it's just kind of an extension of what was happening then, and with each layer, it slowly adds to what's in this space. And the desire for VR came a lot of that kind of 50s, 60s, where it came out of cinema, but also other forms of intoxication, drugs, art, alcohol, sex. And then right after, as kind of things do, the world of virtual reality moved into military use, warfare, medical, flight simulation, etc. In the 80s, 90s, there was a revival with some of the people that I've talked to, where people were playing a lot and thinking a lot in this space before computers and the internet became much more exciting. And then for the past 5 or 7 years, there's been another kind of force of momentum because headsets for VR finally got to a place where they were affordable and they were within reach. And people picked up on the experiments that were left over in the 90s and kind of pushed them further. So 2 projects from that last era that I want to mention is one is the experiments that Jeffrey Shaw was doing. This is the televirtual chit chat, where 2 users could position and negotiate half a dozen or so letters in space and take turns manipulating them. Another one of his projects was the Legible City, and a follow-up called the Distribute Legible City, where the viewer was on a stationary bicycle biking through space and would see these large narratives that felt and looked like buildings and manipulate information that way. So a lot of people thinking on how do you read, how do you experience, how do you pull and interact with text once it's all around you. And the person whose shoulders and thinking we're all standing on was Muriel Cooper, who founded MIT's Visual Language Workshop and later co-founded MIT's Media Lab. Her work in the 80s was already exploring a lot of considerations on how to deal with narrative, hierarchy, typographic navigation in virtual 3D space. She pushed for coming up with new metaphors and models to consider text in a less linear fashion, such as the highway, and instead to consider information as a landscape. The title of the talk, Text in the Expanded Field, is a riff on Krauss's essay Sculpture in the Expanded Field from the late 70s. So next, we kind of got up the little history bit, and now what's happening in the XR space today and who's playing with it. Because of the production channels, it's mostly game developers and UI designers with a little bit of people from motion movie trailer world that are playing with AR. So you can probably kind of get an idea from that of what it looks like. There's a whole lot of faceless narrow sans type, and there's crazy extruded texture dragon text, but placed on top of a traditional all caps, likely serif base. Basic terminology. I'm using the term for what this is all called is continually changing as the field develops or as people don't want to be associated with the last experiments and want to be seen as their own thing. I'm using the term extended reality, which kind of covers both augmented reality and virtual reality under the same umbrella. The two main things that the way people are dealing with text there is diegetic, which means it exists in the virtual space, something that you see actually printed on a cube, and physical, or non-diegetic, which is a pop-up or something coming up on the outside of the world and interrupting that experience. So now we'll look at what's happening in text typography there, how it's functioning, and what type designers can do to kind of help make it more legible and more functional. AR, the viewers are currently really limited, so it's primarily experienced via your phone or your tablet, which means that the limitations on that are the same as limitations on your phone or your tablet. Anything can kind of look good on there, but it also means it looks just like a video or a phone app. There's really no experiential difference. Actually, a lot of the stuff we're seeing out there that is seen as augmented reality is After Effects mockups. For VR, it is the current headwear that's driving a lot of the current zeitgeist, which, like any emergent technology, there's going to be bumps and issues. There's a resolution limit, there's a processing limit, the optics are completely different in different devices, colors break out, glyphs blur into other glyphs, and so it kind of has the same look as early televisions where you get the red side and you get the blue side. And because it's that, but with a bifurcated screen, if you slightly move the glasses, if you slightly misalign, if your vision's a little different, that distortion gets even greater. So this is what's running it and what's happening behind the scenes. Vectors take too much calculation and GPU resource to use, so everyone's throwing them out. Most of what's coming up is actually bitmap fonts, so we're kind of going back to that era. And then the other thing is things are being translated into meshes and things that people are used to working with in terms of 3D software. There's signed distance field, which was developed and is being used in Unity, which is a text rendering method that avoids the need to use bitmap fonts. So instead, it stores the distance to each texel to the edge of the character, interpolating as it scales. Because if you have bitmap fonts in virtual reality and you're moving further away and closer to the object, it's going to constantly have to recreate new bitmaps, and it's an incredibly inefficient way of doing it. So signed distance field kind of gets rid of that need, but it produces other issues where it can't hold sharp corners and it kind of starts rounding things. And then hybrid multi-channel distance field was created as an improvement of that, so text now can have sharp corners, and it doesn't have to be bitmap, but it's still, every time you're using text in anything extended reality, it's going through 3 or 4 different technical translations on the back end. What you come out with is not, to a type designer or someone that's used to looking at small details, it's not really representative of what's going in. So when I'm talking to people and I'm like, what are the problems you're having? What do you need? What can we do? The issues are file size, the deterioration that happens through all this translation, the lack of user text input, because if you have a headset on and your arms are kind of flopping around and you have like a little controller, you can't really roll through the alphabet and input text very well, and just a lack of guidelines and a lack of anyone talking to them about what the optimum best way to do that. So in terms of file size and getting things closer to where they're at for text in applications we're more used to, the engineers are working that. They're dealing with a lot of adding really basic things and bidirectional text and OpenType features right now, and they can handle that. In terms of type design, a lot of the problems with legibility are the same ones that come up with other low-res systems. Counters close up, tight spacing causes glyphs to crash into each other. The viewport is fairly big and cropped, so there's a preference for condensed fonts. The sharp edges either get harshly anti-aliased or get rounded, so softer fonts work better and come up truer. And there's a preference for a little stroke weight change. So I think for this, you can develop something new, but I think there's already also a lot of things that exist for low res, and just kind of optimizing and guiding people on using that is going to get people a lot of the way there until the technology catches up. When I was talking to a lot of the designers, I'm like, hey, there's already been a lot of fonts and a lot of type that's been developed for low resolution. Why aren't you guys using them? And their response was that they didn't want to look dated. So that's kind of the trade-off they're doing. And for typographers, there's a lot of questions for them to answer in terms of what's the optical, how far away should text be, how does it deal as we move towards it, how do you design responsively for objects as you get nearer to them, what happens to type when you walk around it, yada, yada. And then once technology kind of gets to that next stage, there's going to be a lot of really fun things to think about in terms of in augmented reality, everything's translucent. How do you deal with curvature? How do you deal with things as they drop out of your field of vision? And there's a lot of really fun and interesting questions, but to me, the technology is not quite there yet for me to really tackle that, so I'll just leave them here and keep moving through. So we'll get to display typography and why type designers should care. So what are the primary markets for virtual and augmented reality? There's a lot of use in branding where people have said that there's really strong response to dimensional text and to it used in this kind of more evocative fashion. There's a lot of consumer demand for Snapchat-style communication, so expressive, emotive, fast things that you can, send a video, send a thing, and, write the date, write that it's cool, write love, whatever. And the other thing is type in the diegetic space, so type that actually exists in the real world that you're seeing is easier for the brain to handle than type that pops up. So there's a lot of reason for getting type into that actual world, and that requires dimensionality. It's a medium that's driven by movement. It lends itself really well to ambiguity poetry. There's people using it for music experience, etc. In a lot of these conversations, there's a lot of people building new tools. There's a lot of people trying to address these issues and solve them, I had to sign a whole lot of NDAs for the conversations that I've had. So unfortunately, I cannot tell you the tools that are being built. But there's a lot of people playing and experimenting, and there's a lot of push happening, but none of it is involving type designers, and none of it is in conversation or looking or, kind of meeting those together. So it's a lot of kind of separating out the process. Because the job of dimensioning is cut off from the process of type design, there's a lot of things that break. The XY axis of the font doesn't have little correlation to the Z axis. Kerning details that we've all worked so hard on in our two-dimensional fonts start breaking, and no one's kind of looking at them as they move forward. Other things distort in unintended ways, and so basically I want to move type designers in this space. I think it should be done in cohesion. I think there's a natural conversation between the way you design type and the way you kind of add to it. So so basically when you're in this three-dimensional space, you can't have two-dimensional objects in 3D space. That doesn't work, even if it's really thin, even if we're looking around our actual real space, nothing is 3D, even if it's paper, even if it's whatever, everything has some amount of dimensionality, and it has some way that it's and there's a lot of history of dimensional type. Like this, none of this thinking is new. If you walk around the city and look at any signage, if you look at any store, if you're kind of interacting with that, but even printed, like screen print, it leaves a layer of ink. If you have chalk, it leaves a different texture. It can be really small, but there's always kind of some dimensionality of type, and it's how do you bring that into the extended reality world. And if because I'm just gonna skip that whole part. We have a long history and tradition of dimensional type in signage, in our spaces, and where we walk around. And then at a certain point, the computer came out, and we lost kind of that art form of bending type out of neon, bending it out of metal, and the natural craft and give and take that would result. And now we have a whole lot of like extruded basic fonts. And I want to avoid that in the next era and in the extended reality space. This is, I was just driving around Lisbon, and this is a photo of a license plate. And now we're so used to just these kind of take a basic font shape, punch it out. But this thing is gorgeous. Like, it considers every little element and the way it brings it out. And even that 9, the ridge doesn't go in the exact center of the letter. It moves, and it moves in a way that is cohesive, and it makes sense. And so that, to me, is what a well-designed, like, kind of considered way of bringing two-dimensional type and a third dimension together is. So when you're designing for three-dimensional type for extended reality, you have a whole lot of questions in front of you that you can answer. It's right now, the default is you bring lettering in, you extrude it, you add some color, you call it good, but there's a lot of what is the actual shape, what's the radius if you have a font with different weights, how does that correlate to dimensional space, what's the material, how does it deal with light, how does it reflect, is it a solid or is it made up of a lot of different granular particles, how does it deal with, in extended reality, you're always going to have light, you're going to have shadow, how does the type deal with shadow, how does it drop, how does the shadow reflect on the letters themselves. So for the past couple of weeks, I worked with one of my grad students, Juneza Niazi, and we kind of experimented with some of these considerations and trying to understand just what the range or what the possibilities are on how do you merge two-dimensional type and three-dimensional. So these are a couple of the experiments that she did to just kind of show that three-dimensional type doesn't just have to be take a traditional type and pull it out. And then she also did a lot of things with proximity in terms of what happens to letter forms, what happens to type as you move closer, as you move further away, how do they respond to you, how do they break away. And then, of course, like each of these things that you're introducing can exist on a huge interpolation scale. So you get like the cube that's split into infinite galaxies and dimensions as you keep adding variables and as you try to deal with how they relate to each other. So everything like a simple bubble letter or a simple like kind of dimensionality can then be modified in all these infinite ways. So I feel like the possibilities of what dimensional type can do is fairly endless, but it's grounded in established tradition. And so the stuff that you're seeing today, it's all created as pieces of lettering. So you have someone there grabbing a font. The only default font in Unity is Arial. So you grab a font, you drop it in, it goes through translation after translation in terms of software, and then someone is taking a 3D app like Rhino and then adding the dimension and extrusion. This is incredibly inefficient. Right now, because of the lack of kind of text input, there's customer demand, but people haven't quite figured it out. But even on the just production end between the designers and the marketing team and whoever's working on it, it means that anytime you need to make a slight change, you have to go all the way back to the start and go through that entire process again. And it means that a lot of things that type designers have put so much thought and effort and time into breaks in that process because So there's no ability to edit, there's no ability for user-generated text, and a lot of things kind of distort. So I think type designers need to be moving into the dimensional space. I think we need to be part of the conversation. I think we need to be engaged in how type becomes volumetric, and I think we also need software to help us do that. In the way that, there's all the type software for two-dimensional illustration and kind of the Illustrator equivalent. There should be a type software that's the equivalent of Rhino or a 3D app that allows me to think about all these stuff and not have to constantly circle from the start. So now we're going to talk about, is this actually worth our time? Is there a market? Is there a need? There's definitely a lot of people saying there is. But it's predicting the future, so you can't, it goes both ways. Extended reality is a really fun play space. It captures the imagination. It creates a lot of questions and problems for engineers and designers, so they love playing in it. And I do think that it is kind of, with each round and with each resurgence, it takes a greater foothold. I was walking past a Sephora the other day, and their ad for makeup right now features the girl wearing the makeup is wearing a headset. So we're definitely out of the kind of glass hole category in terms of how this is perceived, how it's used, where it's trying to push and make headway. But there's also, even in the people that are deep into the extended reality world, there's a lot of arguments in terms of, does this have a future, does this not have a future? VR is additive. Most technology throughout history that's tended to take off is often reductive. The way I like to design a lot is by removing things rather than adding experiences. So there's definitely still a conversation there, but even while I don't know exactly where that world is going to go, there's definitely a need for three-dimensional and volumetric type. Extended reality is going to need it. Holograms are going to need it. I was at an airport in Georgia, and the baggage rooms the size of this room, and there's like absolutely nothing there except for 2 holographic ads that are spinning around. And they need type, and they need type that's designed and thoughtful and designed by type designers. Signage is going to need it. 3D printing is going to need it. There's entire houses that are being 3D printed right now, and those houses are going to need house numbers. And designers across industries are going to need a tool to create it that doesn't require the duct tape and porting that's currently involved as it goes through all these kind of translations. So let's see if there's anything else I have to say. So basically, yeah, that's kind of the synopsis. That's my call to action, what I've gone from all these conversations and seeing what people are needing, people are wanting. There's definitely a need for type designers to be in this space and to be part of the conversation. And there's a need for software that helps us do that. And now I'll leave you with one final experiment that Juneza and I worked on, because we can't build that which we can't imagine. That's it.